Hello, folks. This is Craig Lukasik. I am now the acting president of the St. Mary's chapter of the Archaeological Society of Maryland. Hopefully that will be a temporary situation, as I'm sure that some of you may want to come in and help out and do the cat herding roles that we do here and try to get us together for presentations and activities. The Archaeological Society is a volunteer society that's across the state of Maryland, and we work with professionals doing various projects around the state and involved in many different levels. Some are excavations, some are lab work, maybe some are research and different things. I urge you to punch in your browser Archaeology Maryland, and then you get their website will come up, Archaeological Society of Maryland, and see what they do. There's a lot of great activities coming up this spring and into this summer. I do know that in April 9th, there will be an archaeology day that will be at Jefferson Patterson Park. And then you can come and meet us in person there and be involved. I love this particular event because it's kid oriented. And so we get to corrupt young minds and tell them that playing in the dirt is respectable. It's a lot of fun. So come on by. We're going to have a lot of people there. It'll be a wonderful event. In April, I believe it's the 16th, there will be a whole spring symposium series up in Crownsville of all the latest scholarship that's going on in archaeology. If you want to be a part of that, it's either free or really, really cheap. I don't know which one it is. I think this one's free. And then coming in May into June, there's field work over at Barwick's Ordinary, and that's in the Eastern Shore. And that's always really a good learning experience. So we'll have plenty of opportunities for you coming up. And what I'd like to do, though, is explore local opportunities too for you. I'm actually more interested in doing that. But tonight, I'm really thrilled to present Scott Strickland. He is the assistant or associate director over at Jefferson Patterson Park at the Mac Lab, at Jefferson Patterson Park, excuse me. And he runs some archaeological excavations, and he would be interested in engaging with volunteers on site. So are you ready, Scott?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
As Craig mentioned, I'm Scott Strickland. I'm the Deputy Director of the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. And I've been here or working there since August of last year, so I haven't been there very long, about 6 months. But this is kind of a PowerPoint on what I've been doing over the past 6 months and what I plan to do throughout 2022 and moving forward from there. So I will be covering a lot of things. I'll try to go through them somewhat fast so that we do have time for questions, but I hope I don't miss anything. So I've broken it down, what I'm going to talk about, into these little sections. So first, I'm going to talk about the public archaeology program that has existed at the Smith St Leonard site here at Jefferson Patterson Park since 2002 up until just last year. Then I'll talk about two families that had lived on the Jefferson Patterson Park property in the 17th and 18th century, the Smiths and the Taylors. Then I'll be taking a look at a collection from a site called the Stearns site, which is a pre-contact Native American site. And then I'll be going over some interesting little things that we've been working on here and there at the park using fun mapping technology, and I'll show you some examples there. And then lastly, I will go over a grant that we have put in for documenting the community of Wallville or Chitron Neck, which is the area of land where Jefferson Patterson Park is located. So without further ado, I will give a brief history of what's been going down at Smith St Leonard site. And you'll notice I'll be using these numbers here. These are archaeological site numbers, if you're not familiar with them. So 18 stands for Maryland, CV stands for Calvert, and 91 stands for which site it was recorded sequentially. So Smith St Leonard, that site 18 CV 91 was occupied from 1711 to 1754, and those dates are based off of certain documents and when certain landowners had passed away or gave off their land to their heirs. So the first occupant of the site was Richard Smith Jr., followed by his son in 1715, and then followed by his son John in 1748 until 1754. And although the site, at least from the documentary records, looks like it was abandoned in 1754, the buildings there were still standing at least into the 1770s, or at least some of them were. But in addition to being the home of the Smith family, there were a large number of enslaved people who lived on the plantation that the Smiths had developed. And we can get little glimpse of how many people there were and at least their first names and ages from probate records or like inventories that were made after the property owner had died, and enslaved people were listed as property along with all their other goods in their house. So in 1715, there were 42 enslaved people on Richard Smith Jr.'s plantation, 23 of which were described as living at home and at Okies. And Okie is a very interesting name. It is a native word for a god in Algonquin, like Chesapeake cultures. And so Okie might be a native person or a person of mixed race. By 1748-49, Walter Smith had a similar number of people who were enslaved on his plantation, 41 people. But by 1754, John Smith had 24. And in 1783, after that site was no longer occupied, Walter Smith, who still owned the property, but owned a total of 2,346 acres throughout parts of Calvert County, but mainly along St. Leonard Creek in Calvert County. There were 34 enslaved individuals at that time. So a lot was going on. It wasn't just the Smiths. There were lots more families with other stories to tell. The Smith property was part of a boundary dispute in the 1770s between Walter Smith and Thomas Johnson, who was the father of Governor Thomas Johnson, who the Thomas Johnson Bridge is named for, if you've ever gone over that like I do every single day. There were detailed depositions given for property corners and for certain landscape features. And you might notice on the lower left-hand side of that image where you have all those numbers like 33, 34, 35, 36. Those are for meets and bounds for the boundary description. But interspersed in there, you'll see little dots with lowercase cursive letters like A, B, C, D, and G. And those have descriptions within that legal description that describe different buildings. And so what some of those buildings are labeled, you have like a boathouse, an old cellar, a wheat house, cemetery, the house of Richard Smith Sr., the house of Richard Smith Jr., a store, a kitchen, a quarter, likely referring to quarter for enslaved people, a corn house, and a barn. And we get that start date of 1711 for the site from this document where it describes a dwelling house wherein the plaintiff's grandfather lived, on the gable end of which is set in brick, the date of 1711. And if you're familiar with Jefferson Patterson Park, if you've ever been there, if you know where the Patterson house is, there's a little high hill that's somewhat covered in trees. That's where the wheat house was located. And where the Richard Smith Sr. house and cemetery is located, or was located, is roughly where the Museum Service Center for the Mac Lab and for Jefferson Patterson Park is located. This image here shows you a customs warehouse building at Cedar, which is located across the river from Jefferson Patterson Park. And that has a date written with glazed bricks on its gable end of 1757. So the house at the Smith St Leonard site would have had a label written with glazed bricks of 1711 in a similar fashion like this. We know, in addition to listing the number and names of enslaved people on the Smith St Leonard property or the St Leonard property, the inventories also list separate rooms in each house. And usually an inventory, when it was made in the 18th century, they didn't tend to label each room and the items within it unless it was a fairly substantial house. So we already have the sense, even before digging, that there was a substantial house here with multiple rooms, multiple spaces, some of which have very unique architectural features. If you look at the bottom left, you'll see a little square portion of the building labeled porch. And so this was like a porch or a stair tower, which was a very post-medieval kind of architectural style that by the 18th century had mostly died out in England, but was still popular in colonies such as Maryland and Virginia. And what this might have looked like is like this house called Cedar Hill, which is also in Calvert County, which was built around the 1730s, but that's pending some dendrochronology for tree ring dating for getting a more precise date on that house. And it features that porch tower, which is that area with the steps to the left in that image. And so other examples of houses with that kind of style, there was another in Calvert County that has since been demolished that was built around 1680 called Bond's Castle. In Charles County, there's a house that's still standing but has been completely reconfigured called Sarum, and that was built around 1717. There's a house that you can visit that's a museum in Virginia called Bacon's Castle that was built around 1660. And just to show you how this style derived from earlier English styles, this is called Gippiswick Hall, which was built around 1600 in Suffolk, England. So going back to the archaeology of the site, it was known, at least archaeologically, since at least 1981. In 1999, there was a shoreline erosion control project throughout Jefferson Patterson Park. And while they were doing that, a subfloor storage pit that was inside one of the quarters for enslaved was identified. And so that kind of sparked the public archaeology program being at that site. So in 2002 is when it began in earnest. And the last year of public archaeology at the site was just this past late summer. And the result of all that work since 2002 and 2021 was 315 1.5 by 1.5 meter test units. So a lot of test units. And this excavation work was done by my predecessor, now retired, the former Mac Lab Deputy Director Ed Cheney, also known as Boy God King. And from his work, it's conjectured that about 80 to 90% of the main Smith house has since eroded away. And it was found that that 1770s plat was fairly accurate at placing some of these buildings in this landscape, at least their relationship to one another. So it's kind of like a little Rosetta Stone for this site and for the park at large. There are some interesting architectural elements that were present at this site that are somewhat unique. One was early timber frame stable, and the image at the left, what you're seeing are archaeological features that were mapped out in the field that represent holes that were dug, and the little black dots in the center, those are the remnants of the wooden posts that would have been buried in these holes. So it didn't have anything like a brick foundation. These were posts that were buried in the ground from holes that were hand dug. And to give you an idea of what the interior of a stable might look like, this image on the right is a cutaway example that was taken from English Heritage. Other unique structures were a kitchen / laundry building, and the image on the right, you can see archaeologist Alex Glass troweling to map this feature, which included an H-shaped chimney. And the reason why it was H-shaped, you can imagine that the building had 2 main rooms and a large fireplace in either room, so both rooms were heated. There are a number of different quarter sites, and more recently in 2021, we were wrapping up some work at a subfloor pit or series of subfloor pits within one specific quarter, which I show on the right there. And there were at least 4 quarters, probably more, that might have had a road that ran in between them that formed a row of these quarters centered on this road. And here is, you can see the hand of Mac Lab Director Patricia Samford troweling when we were trying to clean this up a little bit for a better photo. I should have put the better photo in here, but this is more like an action shot. But what we were doing out there this year, or I guess last year now, was digging this little square that looks a little out of place that you can see in that image at the right, because we were trying to recover an 18th century shovel that was located in the profile of the pit that was excavated. And so it wasn't just one pit, it was a series of different pits, and some of which overlap with each other. And you can see in this outline here, very faintly in red, I've outlined one storage pit, and then there's another storage pit to the right with some other fill that was on top of both. And here's another profile map of a different part of that feature. And I've circled in red where that shovel was in the side of the wall, and it was just kind of poking out. And so the idea was we were just going to dig a small section to dig down to it, because it was so fragile that it couldn't just be yanked out, and yanking it out would irreparably damage it. And we were hoping that we could get it conserved. And so the big day finally came, and this is a photo of Nicole Daub, who's the head conservator at the Mac Lab, putting strips of plaster on top of it to stabilize it before we popped it out, essentially. And after it was popped out, it immediately went to the X-ray machine that we have at the Mac Lab to see through some of the dirt that was still on it and some of the rust. And it's hard to tell from this photo, especially if you're viewing it on your home computer screen or on your phone. But this shovel probably had a wooden blade, and it was joined together by iron sheathing on either side of that wooden blade. And you can kind of faintly make out 2 little rivets or holes that had nails to secure it in place. But even though the archaeology is now wrapped up at Smith St Leonard, there's still a lot of research potential to be done with the collections that have come out of there. And this is just one such example. Recently, I was looking at the distributions of different types of glass beads at the site, and found that certain beads were found in certain quarters and in certain workplaces that might represent a quarter where someone lived and then the space in which they worked. And so that's just one avenue of research just looking at one single artifact type. And in addition to the site being an 18th century site, there's also a Native American component. There's a shell midden that had been dug into in the 18th century. On the image on the left, you can see one of those holes that was dug through it. This was for the kitchen building. That when they dug down, they dug past the shell midden, or the trash pile with the shell, and dug up some lighter colored clay subsoil. And so that's why that soil looks slightly different and has less shell than the surrounding area. And the Smiths appeared to have collected a number of Native American artifacts, just like people today will go out in fields and collect arrowheads. They were doing the same thing in the 18th century, so they had stashes of Native American artifacts that they found. And in the area around this shell midden, there are higher concentrations of native-made ceramics that date to primarily the late woodland period, so around 900 AD to 1600 AD. So in addition to the Smiths living on this property, there was also a family called the Taylors. And so a little background and a map to show you where these people were located in the landscape. In 1649, that's when Richard Smith Sr. first migrated to Maryland, and he established his home at the site 18 CV 92, which is right near the Mac Lab building. So that image on the right, that large building with the large roof, that's the Mac Lab, and that's where I work. In 1658, to the north of the Smiths, Robert Taylor Sr. was patented land, and he established himself at another recorded site, 18 CV 79, which is currently an agricultural field. He died shortly thereafter, and his son, Robert Taylor Jr., had built his home at a site called Melon Field. And Melon Field is where we're going to have public archaeology this year and for the next few years going forward. In 1682, Robert Taylor Jr. dies, and around the same time that he dies, the land ends up in the hands of the Smith family. And Richard Smith Jr. Set up his first house at the King's Reach site in around 1690, and that's the site 18 CV 83, before he ultimately moved and built a larger, more substantial house at Smith St Leonard, which is where all that public archaeology has been happening for the past 20 years. So a lot's known about the Smiths. They are a prominent family. Less is known about the Taylors. Robert Taylor Sr. immigrated from Virginia in 1651. In 1653, and I won't get into all the details, there could be a talk on just this court case, but Robert Taylor Sr.'s wife, Mary, had a child from another man, and there are a lot of very interesting depositions that appear in the court record. And if you're interested in reading it, just let me know in the chat and I can email it to you. But in 1657, he was named as an assembly member for Patuxent or Calvert County. In 1658 to 1661, he was a justice for Calvert County until his death. Robert Taylor Jr. appears less in the records. He does not have any salacious court cases to his name. He mostly appears in court documents only as a juror, so I guess that's good for him. In 1670, he was also named a justice for Calvert County, but I've only found a record for him for that particular year. But by 1682, he had died. So archaeology has been, or had taken place at the Melon Field site, which was the home of Robert Taylor Jr. In 1987. It first started with a systematic surface collection survey. And on the image on the left, the overall area was the extent of the surface collection unit, and it was broken down into 4 by 4 meter squares where all the artifacts that were viewed on the surface after it had been plowed were documented and plotted out. There were also soil samples taken at even intervals and looked for different soil composition, chemical analysis. And then lastly, by looking at that data where artifacts were concentrated and where there were soil anomalies, Dennis Pogue, the archaeologist, set up 7 2x2 meter excavation units. And so here's kind of an example of what his maps from his surface collection survey indicate. If you've never looked at an archaeology map like this before, essentially the dark color means that there were more artifacts. So the dark portions of that are kind of like your X marks the spot. Maybe you should dig there first. And so that's exactly what he did. And in doing so, identified a number of features that we're going to uncover this year and take another look at, and recovered a number of 17th century artifacts dating from around 1660 to 1680 when Robert Taylor Jr. lived at the site. And so that includes ceramic types like borderware and Staffordshire slipware. But before we do start digging out there, we are going to have Matt McKnight and Zach Singer from the Maryland Historical Trust do a ground penetrating radar survey that encompasses all of the area where Pogue had done his work in 1987, and expanding from there in these little 30 by 30 meter grids that you can see in red on the left-hand side. And we will have open registration for that public archaeology session in the coming months. It's not open just yet, but public archaeology this year will run throughout the entire month of May on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, and the first week in June. So in addition to the public archaeology program, we're also looking at some collections that have been at the Mac Lab for a while. One is a site called the Stern site, which is mostly a late woodland village site dating from around 900 to 1600 AD. The Stern site consists of a north half and a south half. In 1980, a tenant at a house known as the King's Reach House had found 3 chert blades that probably came from a blade cache on the north end of the site. And that caught the attention of archaeologist Mike Smolik, who had come out there, and ultimately led to a wider survey of the Patterson property that was owned by Mary Marvin Patterson. And she ended up donating the property to the state so it could become Jefferson Patterson Park, and ultimately where the Mac Lab was built. And so without the discovery of these 3 blades, we might not know about all these other archaeological sites, and the Mac Lab might not exist, at least not as we know it. But most of the excavation work for that Stern site has taken place in the south end, in the area that was more open agricultural field. And it was first excavated in 1984 and 86 by Dennis Pogue with the help of the Archaeological Society of Maryland. And additional testing took place in 1988 through a grant by archaeologist Lori Stepanidis. And as I mentioned before, it's primarily a late woodland village site that might correspond with one of the smaller villages shown on John Smith's map of the Chesapeake in 1608. And there's some evidence that there might be human occupation as early as the Paleoindian period, which is around 11,000 to 9,500 BC, so quite a long time ago. Pogue's excavations, most of it was in the south end of this field, along with Stepanidis's excavations. And here you can kind of see a a distribution of the total number of artifacts. It was really loaded towards that south end where you see all the red. There was a limited GPR survey that was done in 2021 ahead of a possible septic easement that happened to identify a possible feature where there was artifact concentration. And before the shoreline was stabilized, some of the archaeological features were eroding out of the bank. And you can see in that very lower right-hand photo, you can see all the outline of a pit that was mostly eroded. And so that collection has been at the Mac Lab for quite a while. And Alice Merkel, who is the collections assistant here at the Mac Lab, she rehoused all that material from its original bags, gave it fresh bags and fresh labels. And it's now being cataloged with the help of volunteers, one of which is Isabel here on the right, who's cataloging some lithic artifacts there. And one of the interesting things that Isabel had found as she's been going through this is this point base on the left that has a very defined what's called a flute. And it's a little channel that's chipped away into the stone that's very characteristic of those Paleoindian period points. And this might be what we call a preform, one that was broken before it was finished, because it looks like as they were carving that channel into the stone, it ultimately broke the base off. And the image on the right was another possible fluted point that could give evidence of Paleoindian, at least use of the property, not necessarily an occupation site. So there are lots more things to discover from that collection, and we've only gone through so far 2 boxes out of like 60. So that's just scratching the surface. So I'll kind of wrap up on showing some of the new things that we're trying to do at the Mac Lab and some of the other projects that are ongoing that aren't as intensive as Smith St Leonard, Melon Field, and Stern site. So one thing I've been looking at is LiDAR mapping of the entirety of Jefferson Patterson Park, and LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It's essentially radar or sonar, but instead of using radio waves or sound waves, it's using lasers. And it sensor measures the time it takes for laser light to be reflected, and you can get these really highly accurate elevation models, and you can use that to build hillshade models, which is that image that I have on the left. And it's useful for a lot of things. You might hear about it in the news because people use it to find like ancient Mayan ruins in the jungle, because it has the ability to penetrate tree canopies and make it easier to see things that are hard to access. But it has other uses that are good for my work at the park, and that's for locating where previous archaeological testing has happened without me having to physically go out there and survey it and find the old points. You can actually see little depressions in the hillshade model at a site called the Kings Reach Quarter site where a previous excavation has taken place. And so I can at least accurately place where that excavation happened using field records pretty quick and easy. Some of the features that show up in LiDAR a little better. I'm not finding any ancient towns and great ruins, but things that show up very easily are things like ditches and roads. And so I've been going through and digitizing where some of these ditches and roads were located. And one step after that would be to go out there, go into the woods and try to ground truth and see if I can see these things in person rather than just on a computer screen, because I could be wrong about some of them, and some of them might be modern, while some of them could be very old and historic. One that is corroborated by other evidence is a roadway that shows up on an 1848 coastal survey map that connected the main road that runs through Jefferson Patterson Park to the county road, today known as Maple Road. And there was a dashed line shown on there that it wasn't necessarily a substantial road, but there was a known path that crossed over the head of a cove. I think it's called Duncasters Cove, part of St. Leonard's Creek. And in the LiDAR hillshade model, you can see remnants of that road, including on either side of that marsh, remnants of a land bridge that would have been constructed by hand by somebody, probably enslaved workers, to create this path across. And its last known use was at least in the 1940s, but its first known use might have been at least as early as the 1770s, when portions of that road were mentioned on that 1770s plat document that showed the Smith family buildings on it. In addition to showing that road, that 1848 coastal survey map also shows a row of 3/4 south of what was then the Peterson House. And the image on the bottom right shows you an anomaly in the LiDAR hillshade model that represents a rubble pile from the chimney of that building. And that at least one of those 3 buildings was still standing in 1932 when this aerial photo at the top right was taken. And those quarters were part of a larger Black community in the area that was known as Wallville and Chitron Neck. Sometimes the names were used somewhat interchangeably. And so you might ask, like, where do these names come from? And Wallville gets its name from a post office that was in the home of the Wall family. That if you've ever been to Jefferson Patterson Park and driven down Maple Road, of the Wall family and their post office was located off of Maple Road. And generally that whole area was called Wallville until the steamboat landing and post office was established at Maple's Wharf on St. Leonard's Creek in the 1860s. But Wallville still appears in records even into the early 20th century. The other name, Chittering Neck, I am not sure where that comes from. It's also spelled in documents as Chittering Neck or Chickering Neck. So if anybody has any ideas about where this name originated, please say so in the chat or at the end during the question and answers session. But generally, Chittering Neck is shown in this 1866 atlas, described all the land of the neck of land between Island Creek, which runs by Brooms Island, and St. Leonard Creek. And so earlier, or towards the end of 2021, Patricia Sanford, the director of the MAC Lab, Alex Glass, an archaeologist at the MAC Lab, and I drafted a grant proposal through the National Park Service called the African-American Civil Rights Program, where they give funds for doing research and some survey work that have to do with the Black experience after the Civil War and the fight for equal rights in America. And we tried to tie in this Black community at Chittering Neck, Wallville, into that greater story that was happening throughout the entire United States. And so what we want to do is to try to document some of the places where these people lived, some of which are on archaeological sites that have not been recorded yet, and that we've only done a little bit of ground truthing or field reconnaissance. This is a map from 1902, a soil map, and you'll see like the little roads that run through, like the one that leads down to Maple, which was at Maple's Wharf. And you'll see little squares or dots, and those represent different houses. And most of these houses along Maple Road, we found through records, were the homes of tenant farmers, Black tenant farmers who made up this Wallville Chitron Neck community. And so using that map and using like 1930s aerial photos, we were able to find fairly accurately the locations of some of these buildings or former buildings in the landscape, some of which are on Jefferson Patterson Park property and some of them which are just off. And we were able to find in the middle of the woods, and we got lost one day. We were able to find those sites, and we will be filling out site forms to get them recorded. And hopefully if we get this grant, fingers crossed, we can do some more work out there and really tell a better story. Some people might be familiar with old St. Luke's Church, which was right across from the entrance exit road to Jefferson Patterson Park. It was built in the early 1900s, and the ruins of which were still visible above ground, at least in the 1980s when this photo was taken. And that church traces its roots to the 19th century churches of Alexander Church and what was previously known as the Methodist Episcopal Church for Chittering Neck Mission. The trustees of which were members of the Black Wallville community who lived on and around the Jefferson Patterson Park property. So I know we're getting close to the end on time, so I'll just run through these other things that are happening at Jefferson Patterson Park, try to maybe solicit some information from some of you here. One of our ongoing projects, and where there's another grant in to find more money, is to revamp the Diagnostic Artifacts in Maryland website, which is, if you've never been to this website, just Google Jeff Pat Diagnostics or Maryland Diagnostic Artifacts and you'll find it. But this is a very useful website, and people throughout Maryland and even other states like Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Virginia use this website daily. It's a good tool for identifying different artifacts and being able to date them, including prehistoric ceramics, projectile points, and European and post-colonial ceramics as well. Another ongoing project that's been happening at the Mac Lab has been exterior renovation project, otherwise known as the Envelope Project. You can see a kind of before and after section of the curation storage wing of the building before this renovation, and then the photo at the top right I took this morning. And we're getting ready and gearing up for planning on expanding our storage space to, I guess, take on an estimated 40 years of future growth. As collections keep coming in, we're probably going to be running out of shelf space on some of our storage by the end of this year. So it couldn't come at a better time. And in addition to that, and dovetailing from that, Patricia Sanford, the director of the Mac Lab, and I have been looking at coming up with a cultural resource management plan. And some of that includes digitizing the archaeological work that has taken place at throughout Jefferson Patterson Park. And this is just like one snippet that involved the area around where this expansion's happening at the Mac Lab. In addition, archaeologist Alex Glass has been doing archaeology ahead of renovations of the Patterson House, where they're going to be installing geothermal wells, dry wells, sidewalks, and other utility improvements. And she's uncovered artifacts ranging from that late woodland period from like 900 to 1600 AD, as well as evidence from the two earlier Peterson houses that were there before the current Patterson House was built in the 1930s. And the image at the bottom left is a 1930s oil lamp that was found in one of her excavations there. And as Craig mentioned at the beginning, Discovering Archaeology Day is coming up April 9th. And if there are any ASM members here today that would like to have a table or to participate in any way, please email me here at this email address here, scott.strickland@maryland.gov. And I can send you a registration form, which I need to gather those by March 19th. And if any of you are interested in volunteering with some of the archaeology projects here at the Mac Lab, as I mentioned, there are 60 boxes from that Stern site, and we've only gone through 2 so far. So we could use some help cataloging that, and I could train you on how to catalog native artifacts. We have lots of collections that need rehousing, so they need to be rebagged and have those bags labeled. And if you're interested, we have things that need rehousing from all time periods. And then we will also have probably a backlog of washing artifacts after our public archaeology in May and June. And again, you can just email me directly if you're interested in that. And so there are a number of people I'd like to thank. I'm not going to read everybody's name off of here, but each and every one of the people named here were either directly or indirectly responsible or take credit for me giving this presentation today and help me out in some way. So thank you, Craig, and thank you, Zoe. And if there are any questions, you can either ask it through your mic or ask it in the chat. And I hope I can answer everybody's questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the presentation and showing us what's going on and what kind of opportunities. I didn't know there was so much going on up there right now. And it's really close to us down here at St. Mary's. And I think it'd be a wonderful opportunity to get up there and start getting involved. Thank you.